This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
We've had author Nate Hendley on the show a few times with a couple of his true crime books, such as The Beetle Bandit, about a murderous 1964 bank heist, or his chilling tale, The Boy on the Bicycle, about the 1956 murder of a 7-year-old Toronto boy. Well, his latest true story goes back even further. It's called Atrocity on the Atlantic, attack on a hospital ship during the Great War, which takes us back to World War I. Nate joins us via Zoom from Toronto. Hi, Nate.
Hello, Peter. Good to be here.
Great to have you back on the show. This is a little bit of a departure for you because, as I mentioned, you're known for true crime, but this is a story that takes place, A, during the war, and B, it goes back further than, shall we say, living memory. What made you do this particular book?
Well, I've always been interested in history, particularly military history, and I was somewhat stunned to come across this story a couple of years ago. I had absolutely no previous knowledge of this, and there is sort of a crime element because there's sort of a war crime aspect to this. So I figured it wasn't too far off the beaten track of what I've done before, but it definitely is sort of a slightly different genre for me. And I've, put a lot of research into it, and hopefully the readers can appreciate it.
Well, we'll get into the story in a little bit, but this goes back, as I mentioned, to 1918. So was this a bit of a departure for you to do the research? Because it's not like you have television news coverage or eyewitnesses. This is going back a little further than the stuff that you've been doing before.
It is. There are sort of two aspects to that, is that I do a fair number of articles for TVO, the website of TV Ontario, TVO.org. And a lot of those have been sort of historic topics, like 19th century court cases. I did one about public hangings in Ontario, which used to be a thing in the 1840s or so. So I had that background. And some of the research was familiar, like going through archives, going through old newspaper accounts, reading books that existed on the topic. But you're correct. There were no living people, obviously, who could talk about this. I was able to speak to some descendants of people who had either victims or survivors of the Landovery Castle. So that was quite an honor. I was able to speak to a guy who was his grandfather was one of only 6 Canadian survivors of the attack. The grandfather was named Sergeant Arthur Knight. So I was able to get that human aspect of it. And I tried to get as many diary entries and letters written by people who were on the Landovery Castle as possible to, put their voice into the story.
Okay, so let's tell us about the story. This is basically a German submarine that sank a Canadian military hospital ship during the First World War. Tell us about the attack and also the outrage that it sparked.
Okay, well, the ship was called the Landovery Castle. It's a former passenger liner turned into a hospital ship. These are vessels that are used to take very badly wounded soldiers from England to Canada to recuperate, sometimes for years. Landovery Castle is returning to England to pick up more patients, and it is torpedoed by German U-boat 86 submarine. Now, the submarine thought that there were American aviators on board. There's some mystery as to why it thought there were aviators on board. Submarine surfaces, it interrogates survivors who were in lifeboats, and the captain of the submarine realizes he's made a huge mistake, that he has no justification for sinking the ship. Under the Hague Conventions, these are pre-war treaties that Germany signed, England signed, all the big countries signed. Hospital ships are supposed to be off limits. You can stop them, you can board them, you can't sink them. And in return, hospital ships have to be painted white, they have to be brightly lit at night, and they can't carry armed soldiers or munitions. So any justification for sinking the ship is gone at this point. So the sub-commander decides he's going to try to eliminate all the witnesses to his war crime, and he starts shelling. He has the submarine deck gun shell the lifeboats. One lifeboat with 24 survivors escapes. There's 6 Canadian medical staff on this lifeboat, 18 British ship crew members of the ship. And when the survivors are rescued by a British destroyer, there's just absolute global outrage. Keep in mind, the war has been grinding on by this point for years. There's been all sorts of brutality, gas warfare, massive amounts of death, massive casualties. So you'd think the world would be kind of, numb to the horror of war by this point. But this event really shocks people, particularly the notion of the submarine shelling lifeboats. And also there were 14 female nurses on the ship who were all drowned. And the notion of these, brave women dying under the most horrible circumstances, it just shocks the world. And this is front page news, from Great Britain to Australia to the United States. Just New York Times puts this on the front page. This is a really sensational story for the time.
Do we get to know the German submarines' angle on this story? Because as you said, there definitely is a war crime here. The fact that that he decided to remove all evidence of the fact that he made a mistake. But do we know that he actually made a mistake, or did he intend on sinking the ship?
That's a good point. We know that he did not sink the ship by accident. Sailors from the submarine later testified in court. They knew the Landovery Castle was a hospital ship. By its lights, they could identify that it was a hospital ship. They knew that it was unarmed, but they sank it anyway. Now, you got to understand a few things. In 1917, the Germans reintroduced what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. It's their way to try to break through the stalemate on the Western Front, which means their submarines can sink any merchant ship on sight. They don't have to warn them. And corresponding with that, the German Admiralty permits its subs to sink hospital ships. It's convinced, the German Navy is convinced the Allies are abusing hospital ships. They're convinced they're being used to transport supplies and war munitions and soldiers against the Hague rules. And there's a grain of truth to that, because the Germans had sunk a passenger liner called the Lusitania, probably familiar.
Yes.
In 1915. And this caused howls of outrage. A lot of Americans were on board, were killed. And it turns out that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies. So the Germans felt they had a little justification. Now, the authorization to sink hospital ships only applies to the Mediterranean Sea and a, quote, maritime zone from the English Channel to the North Sea. Landovery Castle isn't anywhere near this, but they figured it's still a legitimate target. So this is why it was sunk. And also, by this point in the war, the German Navy, they're getting increasingly paranoid. The British Navy is sending out what they call Q ships, which are disguised war vessels. And they're disguised to look like a really rundown steamer. They allow the subs to get close, and then they blow them to pieces. So the German Navy is getting really paranoid by this point. And also, it's later stages of the war. So Germany is also getting very desperate. So that all contributed to them sinking the Landovery Castle. But yes, just to clarify, they knew it was a hospital ship and it was deliberately sunk.
So besides the outrage, you mentioned a testimony. So what was the fallout of all of this in the end?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the end, it was the Landovery Castle case was one of the few cases adjudicated at the Leipzig war crime trials. This is a big discovery for me. Everyone knows there were war crime trials after World War II, Nuremberg trials. Well, guess what? There were also trials after World War I. I didn't know about this. They wanted to put the commander of the sub on trial. They can't find him. He's absconded to Danzig, which is now an independent free city and under the jurisdiction of the League of Nations. All sorts of complicated Treaty of Versailles stuff. So they arrest two of the lieutenants from the sub who assisted with the shelling, the lifeboats. And the German Supreme Court, who was hearing the trial, they make these two incredibly important rulings, or precedents in their ruling. They find these two lieutenants guilty. And they say, you might not have directed the shelling, but you took part in what was obviously a criminal act. Like shelling shipwrecked people in a lifeboat, there's no doubt that this is against all sort of humanity and laws. So they said, you are responsible, you can still be culpable for a war crime, even if you're just obeying orders. And war crimes should be judged by international standards. Doesn't matter what the German Navy said about permitting attacks on hospital ships. You know, we have international standards to go by. And this becomes a hugely important decision that at the time is very much overlooked. But during the Second World War, prosecutors pick up on this and they say, you know, a lot of Nazi defendants are like, well, we were just following orders. And prosecutors are like, no. 1921, a German court said in the Leipzig trials, that doesn't count. You can't just fob off, committing horrible acts in wartime by the argument you're just obeying your commander. That was set in this Landovery Castle case. So it becomes this hugely important ruling. And then mysteriously, the Landovery Castle case is largely forgotten around the world for various reasons I mentioned in my book.
Wow. And again, it's another book that is beautifully researched by you and a fascinating story. Nate, I thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us once again.
Absolutely. It's pleasure to speak with you, Peter. And I just love to get word out about this new book and this important topic.
Nate Hendley, author of Atrocity on the Atlantic, Attack on a Hospital Ship During the Great War. You can go to my website at thestufffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0766, and you'll find links to Nate's site, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuph is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.